Hello, most welcome to 1179. We are presently in Torrekulla, about 20 kilometers south of Gothenburg, in the municipality of Mölndal. And here I'm actually staying at something that I always associated with the movie The Shining. It's an isolated hotel, or rather a hostel of really weird character. It's been rearranged to something else, but I wondered who lived here once upon a time. It's a bit spooky. There's no houses around, and I fail to see the attraction of the area, except it's very naturesque, but it's not close to anything specific. Well, goes to wonders. Today I will look more at Zuhanden and vorhanden things, how we do with the world, and as we've been into many times before, this is extraordinarily important, because this is the foundation of meaning, how we use ourselves in interaction with the world. And that is the most important message of Heidegger, the one that really sets him apart from any other thinker whatsoever. It is unique to Heidegger, and I think it's something that for me rang a bell as something I experienced before, and this is how meaning is viewed in the East. Not as something that is of the world, but it is something in the interaction between me and the world. So, of the world, that everything is out there, in the end means, as many of neurologists have found now, means that it's no meaning, that there is no meaning at all, or that the subject sort of attaches meaning that is random, introducing randomness into the system. But in the interaction, to learn a verb, learn an adjective, is doing it, being with it. And my first take on that was iteration. If you might remember, for every time I iterate the word caña, which means glass of beer, small glass of beer at a restaurant in Spain, my pronunciation, my embodiment of the word becomes stronger, and one cannot say the meaning is situated within me or not without me. It is both, although they are very, very different. And this is exactly how it is. Caña goes stronger and stronger. It becomes something that I can do, just like the hammer in Heidegger. By doing it more and more, the hammer moves from being an object that hits my thumb, and I knew the meaning in the end of hammer, whereas you never ever touched the hammer, you never used it, you only have the word. Then of course, I have to really be strong here, then of course you don't have the meaning of the word hammer. How could you? But often today we claim that, and with this multitude of technological terms we have today, we get confused. We no longer know what words we know meaning of, and by this confusion we will know nothing, not even the words that we are sure of. And we leave reality and we become disembodied or unreal. This is what Heidegger calls inauthentic living. It is not a criticism of inauthentic living. Remember that. Heidegger is not a criticizer, he's much more than that. But if you realize inauthentic living is not having access to the words, skip, so to say, skipping levels, not going to the grounds and the foundations, going back to the start. In the East, often people, when they start calligraphy, has to repeat, if you prefer, iterate the one letter, a letter that stands for one, ichi, again and again and again. And it's very, very hard. The reason is it feels that you really know already from the start what it is, what you can do, and in a way you feel obliterated. Why do I have to do this like a school child over and over again? I know the meaning of these expressions. I know them by heart. I know ichi. But then slowly you realize it takes time. And you make your body foundational. You make your body the instrument, and you make it more precise. And therefore you gain the meaning. And you also understand, maybe even more important, how meaning is to be gained. That could be the most important lesson. That takes, at some instance, some bit of humility. But in the end, you grow from that exponentially. Without doing that, we will not be founded in terminology. And many times we swept into this problem of today that it's just empty concepts. But it's not the concepts are empty in themselves, it's the use of them. The ones teaching the concepts don't know the meanings, and therefore, of course, the students assumes that there is no reality somehow, or inner or outer, and hammer doesn't mean anything. How could a hammer mean anything if you never touched one? It is impossible. It is absolutely impossible. But still, it is assumed that I will know Antarctica, although I never been there, never walked there. I saw it on telly. Wouldn't that be enough? No. How could it? No wonder we turn postmodern. So this is an article by Mark Coeckelbergh, and it's published in the AI and Society, and it's an original article. Skillful coping with and through technologies. Abstract. Dreyfus's work is widely known for its critique of artificial intelligence, and still stands as an example of how to do excellent philosophical work that is at the same time relevant to contemporary technological and scientific developments. But for philosophers of technology, especially for those sympathetic to using Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and Wittgenstein as sources of inspiration, it has much more to offer. This paper outlines Dreyfus's account of skillful coping and critically evaluates its potential for thinking about technology. First, it's argued that his account of skillful coping can be developed into a general view about handling technology which gives due attention to know-how, implicit knowledge, and embodiment. Then a number of outstanding challenges are identified that are difficult to cope with if one remains entirely within the world of Dreyfus's writing. They concern questions regarding other conceptualizations of technology and human-technology relations. 2. Issues concerning how to conceptualize the social and the relation between skill, meaning, and practices. And 3. The question about the ethical and political implications of his view, including how virtue and skill are related. Acknowledging some known discussions about Dreyfus's work, but also drawing on other material and on the author's previous writings, the paper suggests that to address these challenges and develop the account of skillful coping into a wider scoped Dreyfus-inspired philosophy of technology. It could take more distance from Heidegger's conceptions of technology and benefit from more engagement with work in post-phenomenology, pragmatism, and the later Wittgenstein and virtue ethics. It's like approaching a fine dish. Introduction. For philosophers of technology, Dreyfus's work is an attractive and outstanding example of how one can combine philosophical thinking with a focus on specific technologies such as artificial intelligence, AI, and indeed how one can do excellent philosophy by thinking about technology. Compared to the often shallow contemporary debates about AI, robotics, or transhumanism, for example, Dreyfus's thinking is a relief. His philosophical arguments against the idea that AI can give us human-like general intelligence are still highly relevant today. When absurd Platonic Cartesian ideas such as mind uploading or projects trying to artificially recreate the human brain are gaining more traction than they deserve. But there is more to Dreyfus's work than thinking about AI, and there is much more to be gained from it for thinking about technology, especially for those philosophers sympathetic to using Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and Wittgenstein. This paper focuses on Dreyfus's account of skillful coping and critically evaluates its potential for thinking about technologies today. after sketching a brief working account of skillful coping and exploring what it means for thinking about technology, a number of challenges are identified, and some avenues to cope with these challenges are opened up, partly by drawing on Dreyfus and partly by going against or beyond Dreyfus. In particular, the paper identifies problems related to 1. Dreyfus's selection of tool use as the only way to conceptualize technology, and what Heidegger calls the embodiment relation as the only relevant human/technology relation, together with the unfortunate repetition of the later Heidegger's inconsistencies and bias regarding contemporary technologies. 2. His underdeveloped conceptualization of the social and of the relations between skill, meaning, and practice. 3. The question regarding the ethical and political implications of his view, including the question how skill and virtue are related. In the course of the paper, there be reference to some known debates about Dreyfus's approach, which are often related to its Heideggerian dimension, such as his Heideggerian interpretation of ground and his conceptualization of the social in terms of das Man. But the paper will also introduce other material to the discussion about Dreyfus's work, such as Ide and Dewey. This will lead to opening up some avenues that are not fully present in Dreyfus's own writing. In response to the problem identified, the paper proposes some ways in which a Dreyfus-inspired phenomenology of technology use and skill can be constructed and elaborated, but also revised to address or avoid the problems previously indicated. Conceptual tools offered include philosophical schools and traditions Dreyfus sympathized with, but focusing mainly on Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and never fully used post-phenomenology, Dewey, the later Wittgenstein, and the tradition of virtue ethics. The latter interpreted in a way that replaces the Platonic and Aristotelian obsession with theory with the love of practical wisdom and know-how, and an emphasis on the exercise of skill. In the course of the paper, some of these suggestions and new directions are supported by referring to the author's own work on skill and technology, which is inspired by Dreyfus's view, but also critical of it. In conclusion, the suggestions and directions offered in the course of the paper are drawn together and presented as elements for a Dreyfus-inspired research program in philosophy of technology. It is also stressed that the general direction Dreyfus took in his thinking on skill is not only important for philosophy of technology, but also stands as one of the conceptual building blocks all philosophers have at their disposal today to cope with the ghost that continues to haunt both philosophy and AI. The crazy idea that knowledge and thinking can be entirely formalized and divorced from lived experience and active coping in the world. Two, Dreyfus's account of skillful coping and its implications for thinking about technology. 2.1 Skillful coping. Dreyfus's skillful coping view is based on his reading of the early Heidegger of Being and Time, and has later found expressions in the account of skill development, which he worked out with his brother Stuart Dreyfus, and in subsequent papers, some of which are bundled in the book Skillful Coping, that further elaborated this account and defended it against some objections. The main idea is that in practical activity and skillful coping, we do not rely on rules or mental representations, at least when we gain a sufficiently high degree of expertise and mastery. In Being and Time, Heidegger already made a distinction between two modes of experiencing a tool. When we use a tool, the tool withdraws, we do not notice it, it is ready to hand, Zuhanden. Under other circumstances, for instance, when something goes wrong, it might become present at hand, but the default mode, we might say, is ready to hand. For example, when I use my computer to write this paper, I do not notice the computer, but when the operating system crashes, the technology becomes present at hand. Moreover, in our skillful coping, we do not usually need mental representation. In Phenomenology of Perception 62, Merleau-Ponty already emphasized embodiment and what Dreyfus interprets as a critique of mental representations. He explains that Merleau-Ponty's terms the intentional arc and getting a maximal grip imply that skill as a tight connection between the agent and the world. It is not stored in the form of representations in the mind, but instead as an embodied tendency to respond. We are already set to respond, so to speak. Influenced by Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, Dreyfus in turn argued that our knowledge of handling things involves a know-how that is not explicit. We are absorbed in what we do, perhaps even in a state of flow, and we respond to the situation. According to Merleau-Ponty, in absurd, skillful coping, I don't need mental representation of my goal. Rather, acting is experienced as a steady flow of skillful activities in response to one's sense of the situation. Against representationalism and Cartesianism in philosophy of mind and action, Dreyfus argued that phenomenology of and knowledge involved in practical activity and skill acquisition is not based on rules or mental representations, but involves a coping that, especially one is an expert, is based on implicit know-how and intuition. Our activity may be goal-directed, but we don't think about the goal. Deliberation only comes in when coping is blocked, or indeed when we learn a new skill. We need rules when we are novices, but experts can do without them. Rules are for beginners. As we move through stages of skill development, we rely on concrete experience rather than abstract principles. In the paper written with his brother Stuart, they give the examples of language learning, chess playing, and flying an airplane, which entail performances and responses without the application of rules and principles. The expert pilot, having finally reached his non-analytical stage of performance, responds intuitively and appropriately to his current situation. Excuse me, I'm just gonna get some coffee. Excuse me. Moreover, experts can have the experience that they are intensely absorbed in what they do. Here, there is no longer self-monitoring at all. Quote, masterful performance only takes place when the expert, who no longer needs principles, can cease to pay conscious attention to his performance and can let all the mental energy previously used in monitoring his performance go into producing almost instantaneously the appropriate perspective and its associated action. Other terms that qualify this experience are holistic and integrated. Elsewhere, Dreyfus argued that bodily skills such as swimming requires a kind of unification and integration and cannot be reduced to rules and sequences of movements learned by beginners. Quote, even though bodily skills, for example, are sometimes learned by following rules which dictate a sequence of simple movements, when the performer becomes proficient, the simple movements are left behind, and a single unified, flexible, purposive pattern of behavior is all that remains. It makes no sense to attempt to capture a skill by using a representation of the original elements used by beginners, since these elements are not integrated into the final skill. In contrast to computers, which need to recognize an object to manipulate it, Dreyfus argued humans do it in a more Gestalt-like manner and instead can manipulate an object in order to recognize it. In other words, they cope with the object. Against McDowell, Dreyfus argued that experience is not inherently conceptual and that we have to overcome the myth of the mental. While it's plausible that, as Wrathall has argued, both McDowell and Dreyfus share the view that our engagements with the world are situated and are each in their own way committed to phenomenology, a view McDowell reached through Wittgenstein, Dreyfus mainly through Heidegger. Dreyfus did not share the former's strong emphasis on the rational and conceptual. Perception is not conceptual all the way out, as McDowell argued. Instead, Dreyfus focused on a non-conceptual embodied coping. Against cognitivism and against representing things from a detached theoretical perspective, he argued that our everyday coping does not require our minds to impose meanings onto the world. We need to consider the possibility that embodied beings like us take as input energy from the physical universe and process it in such a way as to open them to a world organized in terms of their needs, interests, and bodily capacities. without their minds needing to impose a meaning. On a meaningless given, which is crazy. Instead, in our everyday coping, the world is already meaningful for us. Moreover, whereas McDowell interprets Aristotle's account of practical wisdom, phronesis, in terms of responding to reasons, Dreyfus, using Heidegger, argued that practical wisdom is more like seeing what to do in a particular situation. It is about being responsive to the specific situation. Or more precisely, both thinkers share the interpretation of Aristotle's concept of practical wisdom in terms of responding to specific situations. But they have a different view of the role of reasons and concepts in this responding. According to Dreyfus, reasons are retroactive rationalizations, and unreflective action is not about rationality. Dreyfus repeated that when we learn a skill, we may use rules as a kind of aid first, but like the training wheels of children who learn to ride a bicycle, when we become experts, we can leave them out and we can switch to a more involved and situated way of coping. Dreyfus's point was not that mental representations, goal-directedness, reasons, etc. play no role at all in human experience. The point was that they do not usually play a role when we decide as experts. They may play a role at earlier stages. He thus stressed that some central cases of intelligent behavior, indeed most of our everyday coping, do not require mental representations. He rejected the view that we can only act if we have reasons to do so. Reasons play no role and rather get in the way. Instead, we have to sharpen our ability to make refined discriminations. And of course, a game has rules, but these rules are not stored in the mind or not even followed. Instead, the expert copes, and in her coping, she is sensitive to the rules of the game. Everyday coping is intentional, but not conceptual. We respond to what Gibson called affordances, which happens without thinking at all. For example, doors afford going in and out. But we do not have to think about them, let alone calculate. Do think about this. Do ponder about this. This is extremely important. When we learn a skill, we masterfully respond to specific situations. This gives us a familiarity with the world and an openness to the world, which is not a totality of objects or of states of affairs. Instead, we know how, and our skill opens a world. Our conceptual capacities grow out of our non-conceptual ones. In The Return of the Myth of the Mental, Dreyfus 2007, Dreyfus continued his arguments against McDowell, this time against the claim that in mature human beings, embodied coping is permeated with mindedness. Dreyfus stressed again the non-conceptual and non-mental content of skillful coping and performing. We can monitor our performances while performing, but this actually degrades the performance itself, especially since it disrupts the mindless absorbed coping. Of course, we can step back and reflect, but also that kind of conceptual intentionality is based on a ground floor of motor intentionality, and there is still involved coping going on in the background. Luckily, we are only part-time rational animals. We can exercise our freedom as humans, not so much by thinking rationally, but rather by opening ourselves to being bound, entering our involved coping. In this coping, there is no thinking subject, rather the world may afford or solicit. According to Merleau-Ponty, at the most basic level of being in the world, what does the grasping is not the mind, but the body, with its non-conceptual coping skills, and what is grasped are not unified propositional structures that one can observe and entertain in thought, but more or less indeterminate solicitations to act. To use one of Dreyfus's example, when we take a doorknob to open the door, we do not think about this affordance or solicitation. We respond and do all this without thinking. Again, we can step back, but only against a pervasive background. Yet, like in his previous paper on the topic, Dreyfus acknowledges that there is still an outstanding issue. We still want to know how the conceptual world is related to or emerges from the non-conceptual world. Moreover, against Searle, Dreyfus argued that social meaning and norms are not representational and do not require intentional action. According to Dreyfus, our experience, our everyday involvement conflicts with the logic of constitution and reconstruction proposed by Searle. The problem is not that analysts construct a rational account. We can do that. But it is wrong. It is wrong to suppose that we give meaning to artifacts. According to Dreyfus, following Heidegger and other existential phenomenologists, meaning must not be brought into a meaningless universe. Go suck on that, Carl Sagan. There is already a meaningful world. We are, from the start, socialized into a world in which we cope with equipment. For example, to use money, which is Searle's paradigmatic example, there is no need to think. This piece of paper counts as money. We just use it and already see it as valuable if we grow up with it. This deserves thinking over and over again on it. Really is very telling. There is already a meaningful world. There is already a cultured style which we already pick up as a baby. There is already something binding us, and we learn it without having to be conscious about the rules. Elsewhere, Dreyfus wrote that there is a background to which we respond, a background of practices which does not consist of representations at all. Technology. Whether or not Dreyfus's model of skill acquisition is a sound interpretation of Heidegger, it is an attractive model for understanding the everyday use and handling of technologies. Technology can be a tool we use, or it can be a medium through which we handle objects. In both cases, following Dreyfus, we can say that skillful coping is involved, at least when we are expert users. There is no need to think about the technology. If we are experts, there is even no need to think at all. We respond skillfully to the situation. Through technology, the world offers affordances and solicitations without any need for representation by means of concepts. Many examples Dreyfus uses are technological, such as using a doorknob or driving a car. The expert driver does not need to think about rules on how to shift the gears. If the driver is sufficiently skilled, there is a bodily response appropriate to the situation. Thus, apart from everything else, it may be Dreyfus's account of skillful, it may be a significant contribution to epistemology. Dreyfus' account of skillful coping is to be seen as a contribution to thinking about technology to the extent that it enables us to say more about the kind of knowledge and experience involved in the use of everyday technologies such as hammers, cars, and doorknobs. It seems especially suitable to think about the handling of tools and equipment. Sometimes Dreyfus explicitly addresses the question how we use tools. Drawing on Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and Polanyi, he argued that how we use a tool differs from an explicit experience and a representational knowledge of an object. Taking up Merleau-Ponty's example of the blind man's stick, he writes, "A blind man who runs his hand along the stick he uses to grope his way will be aware of its objective characteristics. When he is using it, however, he is not aware of its objective traits, nor of the pressure in the palm of his hand. Rather, the stick has become, like his body, a transparent access to objects." According to Dreyfus, this use has nothing to do with making calculations or with following rules or principles. It is an embodied kind of coping, a learning of a skill. I first happen to touch something, then I repeat it, correct it, and so on. I consciously intervene to improve my performance, but there is not first a knowledge of rules, whereas the skill performance may be described from the outside by science, for instance, to build a robot, in terms of rules. Whereas the skill performance may be described, and this is important, from the outside by science. Remember, after, logic, explanation comes after. It's also a case of space. It is from the outside science make its rules, how a robot is to be constructed. It's from the outside, technology tells us how our body is working. Remember the couples Connable and their book Body Mapping, that we today actually use technology to map our bodies and thereby hurting them intensely. as so clearly proved by Couples Blakesley in their book Body Map. In terms of rules, these rules need in no way be involved in producing the performance. Nota bene. Hence, this is also a criticism against Gödel. I put that in parentheses. Hence, and luckily, we may add, we can dwell in the world without having to formalize everything. Does this mean that experts use no rules at all? I propose to distinguish between a strong view and a weak view. According to the strong view, experts, qua experts, use no rules at all when they do what they are good at. Perhaps they use rules when they learn something new, but normally they do not need rules. According to the weaker view, experts use both rules and implicit knowledge, depending on the situation. Dreyfus seems to have held the strong view. For the use of technologies, it means that expert users of technology use it without rules, and that everyday coping with and through technology happens without the use of concepts. This strong view also implies that even the attribution of situation-specific aspects in and by thinking is excluded. In this response to McDowell, who, as we have seen, emphasizes the role of concepts and rationality, even in unreflective action. Dreyfus also uses the example of using tools. Now taking up Heidegger's example of the hammer. Dreyfus argues that we do not even need a situation-specific concept. Indeed, in our everyday coping, which he, Heidegger, calls pressing into possibilities, we don't deal with objects with general properties like weight, nor with situation-specific aspects like too heavy. Rather, when everything is going well and we are absorbed in our coping, the equipment we are using withdraws. Then there is no place for a demonstrative concept pointing out our equipment as anything. We do not attribute a general property or even a situation-specific aspect to it. We just cope. Thus, according to Dreyfus, our everyday coping is not permeated by conceptuality at all. When we look at the phenomenology of tool use, we usually see absorbed coping. In absorbed coping, where performance is at its peak, there is no monitoring going on. There is flow. He uses again the example of a tool. I do not see the doorknob as a doorknob when I'm absorbed in using it. There is a direct response to the situation, no concept or thinking. Conceptual mindedness, Dreyfus suggests, is only possible against the background of non-conceptual absorbed coping. These examples show that technology in the form of tools or equipment is important for Dreyfus. It is a part of our life world. The already meaningful world is a world in which we cope with equipment. We are socialized into a world in which we cope with equipment, quote Dreyfus. In this sense, Dreyfus already has a philosophy of technology, or rather, this work, the philosophy of skill coping, is entangled with the philosophy of technology. For thinking about technologies today, his view has great potential. It seems suitable to be connected to other approaches in contemporary philosophy of technology, such as post-phenomenology, that also emphasizes how technology is part of the life world. However, if we want to develop his account of skill coping into a wider scope philosophy of technology, we need more reflection on technology. Not all technology is tool or equipment, or is something we handle and which disappears from view in our use and handling. There are more phenomena and experiences we can associate with technology. And related, it is striking that Dreyfus's examples of everyday artifacts, at least in his work on skill coping, are all technologies. What does his account mean for the contemporary technologies and media, such as the internet and smartphones? Surprisingly, Dreyfus was far more pessimistic about contemporary technologies than one would expect from his account of skillful coping. To put it somewhat simplistically, he did not have a problem with hammers, but he did have a problem with the internet. Can this discrimination be justified, or is it a bias? One not too dissimilar to the bias Heidegger had against modern technologies. And can it be justified on the basis of Dreyfus's own theory of skillful coping? 3. Problems with Dreyfus's conceptions of technology. If we want to make Dreyfus's account of skill fruitful for philosophy of technology, we encounter a number of problems that are related to the limitations of Dreyfus's Heideggerian conception of technology. Like in Heidegger's texts, there are roughly two ways in which technology appears in Dreyfus's work. The first one is technology as a tool, used in everyday coping. This meaning is based on the early Heidegger, being and time. The second one is technology in its modern and contemporary forms, such as the internet. Technology is then seen as a treat to meaning and skilled engagement. Here one could see the influence of the later Heidegger, who embraced craft work but argued that modern technology is enframing and constitutes a danger. Both conceptualizations of technology can be criticized, have been criticized, and must be criticized. The first meaning of technology, technology as a tool, makes sense, but is limited to one human-technology relation. Of course, we often relate to technology as a tool, and it is the case that in our use of the tool usually becomes invisible. But as Ida has shown, there are more human-technology relations. Dreyfus focuses on what Ida calls embodiment, a relation in which the technology withdraws in use. But technology can also appear, for example, as reality to be interpreted or read, or as a quasi-other. Phenomenologically speaking, a thermometer is not so much a tool as a feature of the world we perceive. And if we encounter a humanoid robot, we do not always relate it to as a tool, but often the robot is interacted with it as if it was a human other. When it comes to his work on skill, Dreyfus unnecessarily limits his discussion of technology to tools. It would be interesting to discuss the role of skills and embodied coping, for instance, the reading of technologies, and in our encounters with machines. Here, the post-phenomenological analysis is more sensitive to the various ways in which we experience technologies, whereas Dreyfus has more to say on the skill dimension. A combination of both approaches seem promising. For example, if it is the case that many technologies mediate our experience and action, then using Dreyfus enables us to argue that they do this by reshaping our skilled engagement with the world and others. The second meaning of technology appears in Dreyfus's work on the internet. Here, contemporary technology is seen as alienating and meaningless. In contrast to craft work, according to Dreyfus, distant apprenticeship is an oxymoron. Moreover, Dreyfus assumes that when we enter cyberspace, we leave behind our vulnerable embodied selves and avoid risk as disembodied web surface remote from the real. Dreyfus has rightly raised issues concerning distance, embodiment and meaning. It is important to evaluate uses of contemporary technologies in these terms. But there are at least the following problems with this analysis. First, as Coeckelbergh and others have argued, Heidegger's conception of modern technology is biased and conservative. It is not clear why modern technology would be necessarily more alienating than ancient technology. Dreyfus seemed to adopt this view. In my book, Environmental Skills, Coeckelbergh 2015, I have argued that the internet is not necessarily alienating. Technology might sometimes lead to more engagement with the world. For instance, when it attends us to features of our environment we may not have noticed. For this purpose, it is also necessary to describe and reflect on the phenomenology of technologies as opposed to modern technology, as Heidegger did. Second, to see technology as meaningless or leading to less meaningful lives, contrasts with Dreyfus's own view that the world is always already meaningful and that we use technology as embodied beings. This leads us, third, to the questions regarding embodiment. While Dreyfus is right to expose the problematic recurrence of Platonic dream of leaving the body behind, it is not clear why our use of the internet, or for that matter all contemporary digital or information technology, would be disembodied use. Dreyfus seemed to have confused the Platonic and Cartesian visions of some net enthusiast with the phenomenology of the life world. I argue use of these technologies does not close off possibilities for skilled engagement. Elsewhere, I have also argued against Dreyfus that when we use the internet, we are actively related to our environment as embodied beings. And information technology does involve skills. In other words, it is also a form of skilled coping. And in principle, it could also be a site for the acquisition of new skills and even the learning of mastery. It is true, as Dreyfus has argued, for masters to respond immediately to present situations in a masterful way, they must have had experience of embodied successes and failures. But use of the internet, including distance learning, is also a kind of embodied learning, albeit of a different kind. Dreyfus may have contributed to dispel the myth of the mental. He still seemed to have believed in what we could call the myth of the virtual. The belief that somehow when we use the internet and related contemporary information technologies, we are in a different reality, which is disconnected with the real reality. But Heidegger's and Dreyfus's own approaches try to move beyond dualistic frameworks, and on the basis of Dreyfus's own account of skillful coping, one could claim that in these uses of contemporary technologies, the technology also often withdraws, and that embodied coping is going on, mediated by the new technologies. There is no outside to being in the world and existence. We remain earthly and situated beings. There is one life world. If there is alienation, it cannot be defined in this way. If there is alienation at all, it needs to be conceptualized as a problem of a particular use and relation, rather than as something linked to the technology as such. There is a problem with regard to distance and telepresence. But it should not be conceptualized in terms of a total absence of embodiment. At most, it is a different kind of embodiment. There might be a problem with regard to meaning, but it cannot be the total loss of meaning, since if that is used as is a skillful coping, it has meaning, and in the spirit of Dreyfus, Heidegger, and the later Wittgenstein, we can say that use takes place against the background of a meaningful whole. It may be the case that the processing of date itself is meaningless, but phenomenologically, there is no in itself. Our experience and our engagement with computers, our phones and our coping with data never is without meaning and makes sense against a wider background of meaning. This takes us to Dreyfus's view of the background, which I shall further discuss in the next section. Much better. Four problems with Dreyfus's conceptualization of the social. A related but different outstanding problem raised by Dreyfus's account of skillful coping is how skillful coping is related to meanings not limited to a particular skill performance, meanings that have to do with a relevant practice and, more generally, the social. Skillful coping does not happen in a social vacuum, but is always already linked to larger practices and to a wider social background. Although Dreyfus acknowledges this, the account of skillful coping itself is not very helpful for conceptualizing it. If we want an approach to philosophy of technology that says more about technology than what happens at the level of individual coping, and that is still inspired by Dreyfus, then his underdeveloped dimension of Dreyfus's work needs to be exposed, discussed, and repaired. Partly, Dreyfus's problem here is also a problem for phenomenology. One recurring problem with all phenomenological approaches, including post-phenomenology, is a tendency to limit phenomenological analysis to individual subjects and their relation to the world. This is also applicable to other phenomenological approaches in philosophy of technology. For example, in Ide 90 and Verbeck 2005, the social and the cultural is of course acknowledged, but there is a focus on an I that relates to world mediated by technologies. The root of this problem lies in the classical phenomenological tradition, or at least in individualistic readings of it. From the perspective of other approaches in philosophy of technology, such as critical theory and pragmatism, but also from approaches in the social sciences, it must be asked if Dreyfus sufficiently conceptualized the social and took it seriously. For philosophy of technology, this is an important criticism to discuss, since as social studies of science and technology approaches have always emphasized technology is embedded in social context and cannot be appropriately studied without taking into consideration the social dimension. Consider Dreyfus's example of driving a car. The account of skillful coping is very good in describing the operation of the car, in the sense of changing gears, braking, steering, and indeed the coordination of all these operations. When one is an expert driver, the skills involved no longer require instruction or rules. They are embodied and intuitive. But driving expertise is not only about the operations as such, it also consists in participating in traffic. Traffic is a social phenomenon, and hence driving, in the wider sense, is a social practice. To be skilled in driving means not only to be able to operate the machine, but also to respond to situations in traffic, including its morally relevant features. But describing this requires a phenomenology that is not only about how I relate to the world, but also about others. It requires a more social and relational phenomenology. Let me first explore how this link to the social may be conceptualized from a Dreyfusian, that is mainly Heideggerian, perspective, before suggesting some alternatives that go beyond Dreyfus and take inspiration from Wittgenstein and Dewey. Like Heidegger, Dreyfus does not address the social as his primary focus, but like Heidegger, that does not mean that he does not mention it, or that we cannot reconstruct some conception of the social based on these writings. A good place to start is Dreyfus's references to practices and to the background. Then I will turn to his use of the Heideggerian concept of das Man, the anyone in the words of Dreyfus, and also shared by Wrathall. For one, Dreyfus on the background. The question regarding the background arises from the question about what must be presupposed for a particular practical experience and skillful coping. For example, driving is only possible and makes sense against the background of shared practice and shared norms, and beliefs about what counts as good behavior. Driving is also related to other practices, such as getting to work and shopping. Ultimately, driving is also part of an entire culture and way of doing, which I would call, with Wittgenstein, a form of life. Yet norms and beliefs may already be a bridge too far for Dreyfus, who sees background as something that cannot be made explicit at all. Why? According to Dreyfus, understanding must not be seen as merely epistemological or theoretical problem. Of course, we interpret and explicate, but the basis is practical understanding, everyday coping. Practical understanding must be viewed in a holistic way. This approach is what Dreyfus calls practical holism. He uses one of his favorite activities to illustrate what this means. Practical understanding is holistic in an entirely different way from theoretical understanding. Although practical understanding, everyday coping with things and people, involves explicit beliefs and hypotheses, these can only be meaningful in specific context and against the background of shared practices. And just as we can learn to swim without consciously or unconsciously acquiring a theory of swimming, we acquire these social background practices by being brought up in them, not by forming beliefs or learning rules. Here Dreyfus seems to acknowledge that social and the cultural, based on Dreyfus, we could see the social in terms of the totality of shared practices, which form the background of everyday coping and beliefs, and which make us who we are. The social and the culture are thus embodied in our practices. This is also the case for scientific practices, which are only possible against the background practices. However, Dreyfus refuses to define those background practices in terms of rules. For Dreyfus, this culture background cannot be made explicit and is not in our minds in the form of beliefs or background assumptions, which could, in theory, be made explicit. Cite from Dreyfus. Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty and Wittgenstein suggest that this inherited background of practices cannot be spelled out in a theory because 1. The background is so pervasive that we cannot make it an object of analysis, and 2. The practices involve skill. What makes up the background is not beliefs, but habits and customs. How great! Embodied in the sort of subtle skills which we exhibit in our everyday interaction with things and people. These cannot be reduced to propositional knowledge or rules. We respond to what situations require. Increasingly, Dreyfus speaks of the background rather than a background of shared practices. This use of the term as a noun in subject position is influenced by Searle, who speaks of background. But considered together with his position saying we cannot spell it out, this renders the background somewhat mysterious. Dreyfus argues that the background is hidden and holistic. For Dreyfus, influenced by Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, we cannot describe the background, since when the world functions as a background, it has to withdraw to do its job. It enables other things to show up. This is, according to Dreyfus, how the phenomenology of skilled coping works. Whereas for Searle, the background is a set of mental capacities that makes possible representation. For Dreyfus, meaning is already here. As said in this view, there is no need to bring it in via intentional acts. The world is already meaningful, and the body also confers meaning. Following Heidegger, Dreyfus holds that, and Andler put it, the background is the condition of possibility for there to be anything at all of any significance to being. In this sense, it is like Wittgenstein's form of life. And following Merleau-Ponty, the body as involved in learning of skill and in coping is also a seat of meaning and a concrete incorporation of the background. Dreyfus is right to point to the background as a seat of meaning that is already there and which usually does not need to be made explicit to function. But based on this analysis of background, it is not so clear how the social comes in, and if the social as background must always remain entirely inexplicit. Does Dreyfus really mean that the background cannot even partly be made explicit in terms of rules or norms? Is the idea of a social science, which arguably has this project of explication at its very core, entirely mistaken? Is it senseless to speak of social rules or norms, for example, as social scientists do? And are philosophers who do so entirely misguided? It is not clear why Dreyfus takes on board Wittgenstein's anti-mentalist epistemology and philosophy of mind, but does not seriously engage with Wittgenstein's ideas about games and rules, ideas which influence social scientists. Dreyfus seems to miss an opportunity here to bring in these aspects of the social. For thinking about technology, we seem to be stuck with an account of skillful coping that is holistic and related to the background. But that background cannot be further made explicit at all, and is bound to remain mysterious. An interesting exception occurs when Dreyfus does speak of norms in his comment on style in his response to Searle. He suggests that there are already social norms. There is already something binding us, and we learn that from the early ages on, without having to rely on explicit rules. This makes sense and opens up the possibility of a kind of middle position which recognizes that there are rules, norms, etc., that have some normative power over us, but at the same time acknowledges that we do not learn them in an explicit way, and we do not need them in an explicit, formalized form in order to cope. But this thought is not made explicit, let alone elaborated. Otherwise, we must conclude that Dreyfus simply held on to the more extreme position that the background cannot be made explicit at all. To conclude, the social and cultural can be connected to Dreyfus's thinking about background, but this connection is not further theorized or developed. There is, however, one way in which he theorized the social explicitly, a very Heideggerian way, to which we now turn. For 2, Dreyfus on das Man, the anyone. Dreyfus does say something about the social in his analysis of the early Heidegger. In a very interesting article on the world versus my world, Dreyfus argued that Heidegger's analytic of Dasein was meant to overcome the dilemma of having to choose between prioritizing a transcendental subject and prioritizing a social world. The everyday world is already public. There are already goals and equipment available in society. There are already roles. This thought makes a promising opening to a more social analysis, but then it turns out that Dreyfus restricts the social to a very specific conceptualization of it in the early Heidegger. He points to Heidegger's Das Man. He translates it as the anyone. We do what one does. This threatens authenticity, but it is not just negative, very important. Explaining a hammer means to show what one does with it. In Wittgensteinian terms, there is already agreement in form of life. Heidegger, however, stressed the contrast the anyone with authenticity. We lose ourselves. Dreyfus is maybe more optimistic and argues that we can still give individual style to the modes provided by anyone. But nevertheless, we are constituted by the anyone. Dasein, which as being in the world is always a way of acting, can and must give its individual style to the modes of behavior provided by das Man. Thus, Dasein is both constituted by das Man in that all significance is a social achievement, and yet self-constituting by taking over significances from the anyone to define itself or give itself meaning. With this analysis of the parasitical relation of the individual to the social world, Heidegger gives an account of the relation of the personal to the public, which dissolves the Husserlian problems arising from the priority of my world to the world. Wow, yeah. Dreyfus-inspired. This could be seen as pointing to a kind of Heideggerian social philosophy. Heidegger can be interpreted as arguing that we already find ourselves in a social world and that we are always socially constituted. And it is interesting that Dreyfus says something about the relation between Dasein and anyone, which could be seen as asking a central problem of social philosophy, but then formulated in a Heideggerian way. However, first, even within an Heideggerian framework, it can and has been objected that Dreyfus leaves out what Heidegger calls Mitsein. Olafsson has argued against Dreyfus that he gives a far too large role to das Man, which is only a deformation of our social being, Mitsein. Whatever the best interpretation of Heidegger may be, it turns out that Dreyfus has again said too little about the social and has left too much room for interpretation. His suggestion that human beings depend on the social world is important but underdeveloped. Second, the social is mainly seen as a given and as one monolithic kind of thing. The rules of the antagonistic tendencies and variations within the social are not visible, except in the form of style. But this thought is not elaborated, and the anyone, das Man, itself remains one undifferentiated block or box. Dreyfus's thoughts here are too vulnerable to the objection that in this view there is one das Man, which is not up to change or remains black boxed. Again, this is unhelpful if we want an approach to thinking about technology that takes seriously the social embeddedness of technology. To remedy this, one could resort to Marx or Hegel, who analyzed the social in terms of struggle. This may help to open the black box, so to speak. Or one could go directly to contemporary social sciences, which have more to say on style and the social, and which have also a lot to say on technology and the social. But as already suggested, there is a thinker closer to Dreyfus who also may be of help to say more about the social, Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein's post-Cartesian anti-mentalist view in uncertainty, and his rejection of his earlier Tractatus view that the world is a collection of fact, is in line with Dreyfus's view and supports his arguments against classic AI and his focus on how we cope with everyday problems. The later Wittgenstein understood knowledge not in terms of static inner mental states or objective facts, but suggested a more practical, pragmatic, process-oriented, tacit, and embodied conception of knowledge. Whether in scientific research or in everyday life, our doubts rest on the basis of things that are not doubted, things that are accepted and presupposed. This approach is interesting for philosophers of technology, as it may help us to discuss the issue of trust in technology, and supports a view of technology as skilled and embodied practice and technique that crucially involves implicit knowledge. But we can also use Wittgenstein for the purpose of developing a view of the relation between a specific practical activity or coping and the wider, perhaps implicit social background. Dreyfus has not done this. Although he sometimes referred to Wittgenstein, he did not really use him to further elaborate the holistic relation between everyday coping and the background. But we can. Let me explore some possibilities. One way to start such a project is to draw on scholarship about Dreyfus that makes connections to Wittgenstein. For instance, Ritfeld's work on differences between Dreyfus and McDowell at least suggests that it can be useful to discuss interpretation of Wittgenstein in order to further elaborate a Dreyfusian approach. The same can be said about McManus' comparison on Wittgensteinian and Heideggerian ideas when discussing the concept of background. These critical discussions could be used as a starting point to bring more Wittgenstein into Dreyfus. Hooray! Another way is to draw directly on Wittgenstein. And in line with some suggestion in Winner, I put it into my recent work. Based on the philosophical investigations, I have argued for a holistic and transcendental approach to technology, which sees technological artifact in their use and in the performances as embedded in what Wittgenstein calls games and forms of life. The meaning in and of the particular use and performance are related to our activities, games, and form of life, which are also social and cultural, and which may be presupposed for the particular use and activity to make sense. This is a background, if you wish, but one that is more practical and less mysterious than Dreyfus's. It is transcendental in the sense that it is a condition of possibility for technology, uses and performances. But it is not transcendental in a Kantian, that is abstract categories, or Heideggerian way. Instead, the view I propose connects a particular use and performance, and hence the skill and know-how related to it, to a wider background of games and forms of life which already contain practical know-how. Moreover, this know-how is not necessarily implicit. It contains a lot of implicit knowledge, for sure, but at least part of it can be made explicit in terms of rules. This understanding of the social renders it possible for the social sciences to say something meaningful about the social and our social practices. But more importantly, for the purpose of using Dreyfus's account of skillful coping, it presents a more elaborated and arguably more balanced theory of the relation between skillful coping and its social background, which can at least partly be made explicit. Usually we do not think about the rules of our social games. Usually we do not make explicit our form of life, and maybe we can never make it fully explicit. Maybe not everything can be captured in rules. But surely it makes sense to sometimes formalize for practical purposes that is as a tool. Furthermore, this view also acknowledges the normative dimension of the background, even if these norms may not always be visible, or even if they can only be partly explicated. Finally, with the concept of games, we could also add that the background is not entirely given. We can also change it. We can change our games, and partly that can happen by changing the rules, but it can also happen differently. Technology, for instance, can be a game changer. Yes, indeed. It can disrupt and transform our background understanding and practices. However, I share Dreyfus's Heideggerian intuitions insofar as I believe that such changes are small and slow. Similar to the changes in riverbeds, to use a Wittgensteinian metaphor. Maybe this approach also helps us to relate the conceptual to the non-conceptual, the challenge Dreyfus formulated. If we see the conceptual, logic, reasons, etc., not as things that are out there in the world, but as something that only lives embodied in performance and use, that only exists in our engagement with the world, in particular our use of words and a performance with words, which itself is, like all performances, related and made possible by an implicit background of practices. Then that seems to me at least a preliminary answer to Dreyfus's question. The conception does not have an existence outside our uses and performances, and the use of concepts itself depends on embodiment and an often inexplicit background. Background knowledge, experience and practices that are always already social. This answer is in the spirit of Dreyfus, but influenced by Wittgenstein, and gives more importance to the concept of use, acknowledges its role for the conceptual, and attends to the use of language, which is often neglected in contemporary philosophy of technology. Another route, which is also not necessarily distant from Wittgenstein, is STS, and earlier sociology of knowledge, which usually sees knowledge as socially constructed. In the 90s, Harry Collins already criticized Dreyfus for not taking on board Wittgenstein's notion of form of life, and more generally for not seeing that the structure of knowledge is to be found in the social collectivity. He writes, "For sociologists of scientific knowledge, most of whom think of themselves as jumping off from Wittgenstein's later philosophy, it is surprising that philosophers who lean so heavily on Wittgenstein should even have a concept of